when I was disinvited from Brandeis, and this was in April 8, in that spring, there were two phenomena that were going side by side. One was this whole issue of academic freedom in American universities. The former president of the World Bank was disinvited from his alma mater. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice declined to go and give a commencement speech. For some reason, the president of the IMF, who is not in the least controversial, was also disinvited. So I find myself in good company. But that is one phenomenon. A second phenomenon is the age-old trait of the religion of Islam in resisting criticism. Individuals within Islam who dissent are regarded as heretics, apostates, and they are banished. Individuals from outside of Islam who point to certain uncomfortable truths about Islam are declared Islamophobic. I was disinvited, or at least the Brandeis establishment gave in to pressure that comes from the second. Please, anyone who criticizes Islam is an icon of hate because I became an outsider, but I'm also an infidel and a heretic. I don't want us to confuse the two phenomena. The second one takes advantage of the first. The first is self-inflicted. It is not caused by Islam. The second, Islam's resistance to criticism, is something that Muslims are paying for harshly today. If I take you back in that short period, that timeline of 5 months between Brandeis in April and tonight, I think I have a stream of headlines. You have seen the stream of headlines that illustrate this clash between the West and Islam. A week after I was disinvited, there was the Boko Haram kidnapping of 276 girls in Nigeria. When I look at the pictures and the images of Boko Haram and their actions, what I see is a black flag on the background that reads, La ilaha illallahu Muhammadan Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. I also see the Holy Quran sandwiched between two Kalashnikovs. When that horror happened, the kidnapping of the 276 girls, which was really a manifestation of a larger reign of terror that Boko Haram is unfolding, not only in Nigeria, but they're now spilling over to Cameroon and other countries. What we did in the United States was we expressed our horror and disgust with Boko Haram. And we acknowledged this cry for help of the cyber civic group who got our attention with the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. I congratulate them on getting the ears of the First Lady. We condemned the endemic corruption in Nigeria. We offered assistance in the form of surveillance flights and intelligence gathering. But that outrage back then did not lead us to a declaration of war. So the clash is there, but what we follow up with is restraint. And restraint is what we have been showing for the last 30 years, not only since September 11, 2001. It's for the last 30 or 40 years. A second case I'd like to share with you in that window of 5 months is the case of Meriam Ibrahim, an individual, a woman, pregnant and with a toddler, in Sudan. She is sentenced to death because she is a Christian. Her family report her to the state. Now, I want you to note the difference between Boko Haram, which is a non-state terrorist agency, versus the nation state of Sudan that sits at the United Nations. We have diplomatic relationships with Sudan. We have all kinds of relationships with Sudan. And the country of Sudan has a system where if you are an apostate of Islam, you are put to death. So when this family reports Meriam Ibrahim to the States to say she's no longer a Muslim and she's married to a Christian, she is put in prison, she is put on trial, she is sentenced to death. And one of the things that stayed with me, and I find a fantastic illustration of this clash between what the West believes in and stands for, and those who say they represent pure Islam say, are the words of Meriam Ibrahim's brother, Meriam Ibrahim's Muslim brother, who reached out to the States. He says of her to CNN, "It's one of two. If she repents and returns to our Islamic faith and to the embrace of our family, then we are her family and she's ours. We are prepared to hold her dearer than apples of our eyes. But if she refuses, she should be executed. If she dies, we will have enforced God's word. The solution is that she is executed. As we have been ordered by our prophet, peace be upon him, he who batters his religion, you must kill." What did we do for Meriam? The West showed solidarity. First of all, by making her case iconic. Then we used our diplomatic clout to free her. Again, we showed restraint. We didn't go to war over this. But obviously, we all know that there are more Meriams out there. We know of Pakistan's blasphemy laws. Today in Saudi Arabia, one of our strongest allies in the Gulf arrested 28 Christians who were worshiping at home, a church at home and in private. There is no word about them since I last heard the news. I'll move fast and go to the one organization that right now captivates our attention and not only illustrates this clash, but can also escalate it. And that is the Islamic State. The Islamic states of Iraq and Syria that call themselves the Islamic State have targeted Yazidis and committed genocide against them, and women, and Shia men. These are Muslim men. They declared them non-Muslim. They destroyed temples. They took property. They killed and killed and killed. And we stood by and we watched, all because we want to exercise restraint. Yes, we expressed our shock and horror at the actions of ISIS. But we remained undecided, and we remain undecided. We have been moved to action by the graphic beheadings on YouTube of James Foley and Steve Sotloff, fellow Americans. And that has brought our president, and in fact, Washington in general, to say we need to eradicate this cancer. Does that mean we are back to war? Is this clash of principles and ethics, this clash of philosophies of life and death between the West and Islam, is it going to escalate? Are we at war? I do not blame our president for showing the restraint he does. The West is familiar with war, and we understand that collisions between civilizations like this one can be very, very long, and they can be destructive. We want first to explore ways of fighting this cancer without resorting to war, and so we should. But then it brings me to the question, who are we fighting and what are we fighting? In the last decade, we spent time and money in human life, blood and treasure, chasing a brand name, Al-Qaeda, to the gates of hell. Osama bin Laden is gone, and that is good riddance. And now we have another brand name, the Islamic State, or maybe the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and a myriad other brands of Islamic terrorism. We know that the surgical strike, the military surgical strike that our president has authorized, is capable of beheading, that is taking out the leadership of ISIS. We know that that is possible because we have that military capability. But what if another radical group takes its place, as it most certainly will? Unlike the last decade, when we first declared war on the tactic of terrorism, and later on one brand, we are now acknowledging that these atrocities that revolt us to our very core have something to do with Islam. In an op-ed opinion article in the Wall Street Journal last week, the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates wrote candidly about Islamic extremism. That is a big step forward. Why? Because the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and all the members of the Organization of Islamic Conference were lobbying Western governments for the last 10 years, at least, if not more, to divorce terrorism and violence that is committed in the name of Islam from Islam. So for the UAE government to come out and say, we are fighting Islamic terrorism, for him to call it a cancer, and for him to propose a broad framework of going after them, I see that as a good step forward. Why? Because we get closer. We are not yet there, but we get closer to the source of a problem. And the closer we get to the problem, the more we can broaden our tools and our methods of fighting it. Even in cancer, there is a stage when prevention is better and more attainable than cure. In the last decade, because we refused to face the source of the problem, we reduced our options only to military and surveillance strategies. Now imagine if all cancer research and all cancer doctors relied only on radiation and chemotherapy. Still, let me not be too optimistic, even though I'm a recent American. Still, most American thinkers and policymakers speak of several Islams, some of which are more extreme than others. I beg to disagree. There is, in fact, one Islam and several sets of Muslims, three of which I'll speak about tonight. But before I do that, I would like to address organizations, because I think for us to get closer to the source, we have to ask ourselves, what is the obstacle? And there are, for some reason, organizations that have an interest in the status quo. They seek to silence those who disagree with them. In my case, what keeps coming over and over and over again is my lack of credentials. That is a fallacy that in all issues that we debate is very well known, and the appeal to authority and a relative of the appeal to authority, what Marissa Madinsky from the Yale Daily News columnist called credentialism, is very much debunked. So I'm not going to go into, not going to do a course on fallacies with you. It's out there, we know it. But for the sake of argument, what I want to do is bring to your attention the fact that there are actually men and women in Islam, Islam's long history, who do have the necessary credentials. Pious Muslim men who studied the Quran and Hadith, who studied Islamic jurisprudence and history. And they did that in institutions that will be recognized by any Sunni Muslim or Shia Muslim. And when those individuals called for the change of the sources, when problems arise, they were exiled, they were banished, they were forced to divorce their wives. I'll give you the example of Ali Abdul Razak, who in 1925 proposed to separate Islam from politics. He said the caliphate is not Islamic, and he found, in his argument, he found within Islamic tradition sources that backed him up. His title of alim or expert was revoked. He was forced into silence. Muhammad Mahmud Taha, another pious and dedicated Muslim scholar in Sudan, said to Muslims, please, let's accept the spiritual Islam of Mecca. He argued that the political Islam of Medina did not apply to subsequent generations. What happened to him? He was executed in 1985 for apostasy. Nasser Abu Zaid, an Egyptian, same thing. All the credentials that you could ask for, and he argued that human language had some role in shaping the Quran. He was convicted of apostasy. He was ordered to divorce his wife, received numerous death threats, and then went into exile in the Netherlands. Another expert, Abdul Karim Surosh, Islamic scholar, but this time of Shia, got more credentials than I can ever achieve, and he argued that Muslim clerics should be much farther separated from politics than they are today in Iran. Again, received numerous threats. His lectures were prevented in Iran. Like me, he lives in exile in the US. And I can go on and on. Ahmed Subhi Mansour, a graduate of Al-Azhar, probably the most revered institution in Islam, he proposed to focus only on the Quran and not the Hadith. He was threatened, he was jailed, he now lives in the US. I'm giving you all of these examples, and they're not the only ones, to show that this demand for credentials, this appeal to authority, even when it's there and it's presented, and even when the reforms that they're proposing are piecemeal, really modest, even they are bullied into silence. And now I want to address with you, because I think it is another point that keeps coming up again and again. Why is my experience relevant? Is it because I was raised a Muslim? Is it because I was married off or had my genitals cut? No. Is my experience relevant because my citizenship in Holland was revoked? No. Is it because I'm traumatized? Because I'm angry and I decide to blame my family and my past? No, I'm not angry. I'm very, very happy. I've been happy for a very long time. I'm not angry. I'm not blaming anything or anyone. I'll tell you why and which part of my life experience that is not merely exotic, but that is relevant to what we are seeing now. I learned from my early teachers of Islam that to be a Muslim was to testify that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. I learned to pray 5 times a day, to fast in the month of Ramadan, to give alms to the poor, and to attempt at least one visit to Mecca. My mother, grandmother, my Muslim communities in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya, they were all comfortable in their identities of being Muslims in this way. We were taught by those early teachers to tell the truth, to refrain from gossip and anything that might cause mischief within the community. We were told to look after the poor, the orphans, and the handicapped. We were taught to be generous, and as a girl and a woman, we were taught to be obedient and modest in dress and deed. We were taught to enjoy what is permitted in moderation and to refrain from that which is forbidden, like alcohol and pork, among other things. To be a Muslim was also to worship Allah alone, to venerate the Quran, and to aspire to live according to the example set by the Prophet Muhammad. Not everyone was consistent in meeting these demands. Some people broke the rules some of the time. I didn't always pray. Some people neglected to pay the zakat. Some people neglected to fast. Some people ate meat that was not slaughtered in the way it was supposed to be slaughtered. Some people ate pork and others drank alcohol. In those days, when I was in my teens, if you neglected your religious duties, you were left alone. Sometimes you were gently nudged by a relative or a friend to be more observant. People gossiped a lot about their relatives who were too permissive, who allowed their daughters to stay out late, to date, or to wear short dresses, or miniskirts, trousers, cut their hair, wear makeup. That was always a big problem. I don't remember any tension between Sunnis and Shia. We interacted with non-Muslims, mostly Christians. I lived in Kenya, and there were a lot of Christians in Kenya, with no trouble. And we even unanimously hated the Jews, but we barely mentioned them. There was a lot of domestic violence on our streets, violence in prison, violence in riots, riots in Somalia, civil war. But all of these conflicts were not religious, and they were not fought with religious terminology. The Somali clans were fighting one another to the grave. They were not waging jihad against one another. They just couldn't agree on issues of power and the distribution of resources. Not very different from partisanship here, except that they went a little farther. My grandmother did not justify cutting my genitals as a religious duty per se. She mentioned Islam, but she said it's far more important that you find a husband. When my father married me off, he was far more interested in his honor than in his religious duty. Yes, he did pay lip service to say it is God has made my duty to marry you off, etc., etc., but he didn't really make it into a big deal. The Qali, or the Islamic judge, who was required to marry me and to divorce me, did just that. He was paid and he was gone. Why am I sharing this experience with you? Because millions of Muslims live like this. They worship, they celebrate, they marry, they mourn, and they fight their personal, family, and local fights. They fight their fights and their conflicts, and they settle them according to their customs. And they think of themselves as peaceful, loving people, and they are. But when I was 15 years old, approximately, this is in 1985, a different kind of teacher entered my life. And that is what makes, that experience makes what I have to tell you and my life story relevant to what is going on today. A teacher trained in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt or Iran or even in Pakistan, who comes to tell us that neglecting religious duty makes you an infidel. You're not just naughty, you are an infidel. That taking fellow Muslims who neglect their religious duties, even if you are observant, also makes you a kafir or an infidel by association. That your duty is to command right and forbid wrong. In other words, these teachers were making us not only observant, but they were making us vigilantes so that we could make others observant. You can imagine how annoying that is. I don't know what to call this teacher, so I have decided to call him the preacher teacher. The old-fashioned religious teacher came, taught, got paid, and left. It was a job. It was pretty straightforward. The preacher teacher wanted and created fellowships. The students became his entourage, or as they liked to say, his enlightened vanguard. I once belonged to the vanguard of Sister Aziza, who converted from a coastal socialite in Mombasa and fashion enthusiast to a Sunni zealot to a Shia fanatic. When my mother and brother caught me bad-mouthing the first three caliphs of Sunni Islam as impostors and stating that Ali was Imam, they ordered me to cut ties with Sister Aziza. The parents of other Sunni students were grumbling about her as well. Preacher teachers were not only active in our schools, they were also in our neighborhoods. One who stayed in my memory is Boko Haram, and roughly translated that means he who fasts 100 days. You can only imagine how skinny he was. He preached, like all the others, incessantly about hell. He encouraged us not only to read the Quran and the Hadith, but to use this scripture like a driver's manual. He encouraged us to be relentless in enforcing the rules of Islam, religious duty on family, on relatives, on friends. For the stubborn who refused to obey and observe, we were to cut ties with them and even declare them kafir. He encouraged us to convert non-Muslims or cut ties with them. This preacher-teacher came with a language that was always there, but that was new to our ears. Jihad. We were to wage jihad for the sake of Islam. Martyrdom. The best thing to ever happen to us was to die while fighting for Allah. We were to strive for the establishment of Sharia law in our society and beyond. We were to be suspicious of Christians if they refused to convert to Islam, and we were to aspire to destroy the Jews, all Jews, not only the ones in Israel. The preacher-teacher continued to rant against gays. They were to be hung, and women were to know their place in the effort to mold the Muslim individual, the Muslim family, and the Muslim community and beyond. Their place was at home. They were to sacrifice everything, even life and the lives of their children, for the sake of Allah. Strict obedience to their guardian, father, husband, brother, uncle, grandfather, that was required. We were supposed to cover our heads from head to toe when running errands outside the home. This process of indoctrination that I described, that affected me, I considered myself once a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's this process of indoctrination that I have seen from up close and personal that makes my experience relevant. It's this process of indoctrination that is overlooked. We focus on the jihad, the violence, but we ignore the da'wah. We ignore the years and years and years of preaching. Da'wah in the West is protected under religious freedom, but jihad is not. We have to rethink that. Da'wah leads to intolerance and eventually violence. This preaching teacher, as we speak now, is the cancer, I think, that our president was speaking about, and the ambassador of the UAE. This preaching teacher is active in our communities here in the United States and in the UK and in Europe and in the rest of the world. This preaching teacher is embedded in the homes and streets and neighborhoods and schools and colleges, in mosques and in Muslim centers. Sometimes in Arabic he's called the da'i, and it's not only men. His goals are clear, and he'll use any and all means to indoctrinate young and impressionable minds with the Creed of Jihad. You may have seen the news today in Britain of the study that shows that this indoctrination has gone from teenagers now to young primary school children, 11-year-olds. The main target of this preaching teacher is the Muslim community. And sometimes they make an effort to convert the non-Muslim. Ladies and gentlemen of Yale, every creed has a core. The core of Islam is to submit to the will of Allah by observing the rules in the Quran and the Hadith. Sure, there are Sunni and Shia and several sects within each camp, but they all subscribe to this core. When the Sunni Saudi establishment first established their state, they governed it by this core. When Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 won the confidence of the people of Iran, he proceeded to govern by this core. When the Taliban took land in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, they established Sharia law. When the Muslim Brotherhood won elections in Egypt 2-3 years ago, they sought to achieve the objective that was captured in their motto: Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope, and so goes all the rest. All of this was preceded by years and years and years of da'wah. Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamic State, Boko Haram, they didn't just jump from the sky. They are an outcome of that grassroots movement. Because of this, it is more accurate to speak of one Islam in the context of a clash of civilizations. It's also important to note that we do not clash with all Muslims. Those Muslims who ignore the obligations of intolerance in their core creed are not at war with us. I'll briefly describe these 3 sets of Muslims that I see, and obviously it's a spectrum even within the 3 sets. The first set fully subscribes to the core creed and challenges other Muslims to do so. That is where the preacher-teacher is. They declare those Muslims who lead selective lives. They call them heretics, apostates, infidels, and fake Muslims, or hypocrites. I think that we are at war with them, or we are having the clash with them, but most of all, Muslims, other Muslims are having that clash with them. The second set is a set who are trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance between their confession to the core creed and their own conscience. They have not made up their minds. They wholeheartedly condemn the atrocities committed by the first set. And they condemn it even more because it's committed in their religion. I think in terms of numbers worldwide, the majority of Muslims fall under this second category, and they are the biggest victims of the first category. And finally, there is the third set, the reformers and dissidents. The reformers, and I've given you a few examples earlier, are convinced that the core creed can be bent to suit their conscience. They seek to reinterpret the core creed in the hopes of delegitimizing the extremists like ISIS, the fast set. The dissidents of Islam go even further. They make a choice between what their conscience tells them is right and the commands in the core creed. And they go with their conscience. Instead of merely submitting to Allah, they stand up to Him. I count myself a member of this set. And of those dissidents, not all of us are necessarily atheist. I want to end, I don't know how much time I have. I want to end my presentation tonight with a few questions for the Muslim students of Yale and hopefully in this age of technology beyond. I want to ask you, why do you find energy, resources, time, and solidarity to silence the reformers and dissidents of Islam? Why don't you devote all that energy to exposing and expelling the preaching teacher who has infiltrated your homes, your streets, your neighborhoods, your mosques, your schools, and Muslim centers? The men and women who poison the minds of children and impressionable teachers. Don't you think you should go after them instead of me? I hate to put you on the spot, but I don't get all that often to talk to you. We saw Muslims protest in massive numbers and across many countries over cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in Denmark, Muhammad as a teddy bear in Sudan, the video clip Innocence of Muslims, the Quran burning fest organized by Florida Pastor Terry Jones. Why did we not see masses of Muslim men and women protest in front of the embassies of Sudan demanding the immediate release of Meriam Ibrahim? Why don't Muslims protest the image of the Quran sandwiched between two Kalashnikovs? Why is it okay for the country that is the custodian of the two holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, where over 1 billion people 5 times a day, wherever they are, they face Mecca and Medina? If Islam is a religion of peace, why does Saudi Arabia need to underscore its flag with a sword? If you look at the flag of Saudi Arabia and you look at the flag of the Islamic State, you will see differences in color and differences in font. But what you see when you read the letters is the confession to be a Muslim. La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet or his messenger. Saudi Arabia underscores that with a sword. How can they represent peace? Why are Muslims not demanding answers from them? Why are Muslims silent as their fellow citizens are slaughtered, raped, their sacred places destroyed, their property taken and subjected to perpetual terror in the name of Islam, simply because they belong to a different sect or religion? In other words, where is the Muslim outrage on the blasphemy laws of Pakistan, the implementation of Sharia law in Brunei, the beheading of people for sorcery in the 21st century in Saudi Arabia? I'm not talking about half-hearted condemnations of Boko Haram and ISIS in press releases that end with, "These acts have nothing to do with Islam," and they fly in the true face of Islam. Statements like that come across as if you care more about the image of Islam and less about the loss of human life. Muslim students, you live in a time when Muslims are at a crossroad. Every single day, there is a headline that forces the Muslim individual to choose between his conscience and his creed. The Muslim world is on fire, and those fanning the fire are using your core creed. With every atrocity they commit, they remind the Muslim of his commitment to submit to Allah. Will you submit passively or actively, or will you finally stand up to Allah? Thank you.